Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the broadcast this evening. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you.
What should I wish you? A peaceful program, a morose program, or what?
Sir, I don't know. Given how we would be starting the program this evening, I guess it's a very sad day for Europe and indeed the world. And we've been talking about this particular issue of Russia, Ukraine for some time now. And I think last week or the week before, you specifically said the pendulum was just going in different directions. But now it's swung into a particular direction. And so how do you respond to this? What did you feel when you heard the news that full-scale invasion had started?
Well, thank you, and good evening to our viewers. Maybe I should introduce our program as the voice of reason, rather than the voice of propaganda, in the sense that at least one is going to, we always make an attempt to be objective in the way in which we analyze the news that is there. 3 weeks ago, if you recall, I predicted that the war will break out the following week. And when the following week arrived, I apologized for perhaps having been too much of an alarmist, even though I was making that prediction based on what I saw. Now it looks like I didn't even need to apologize. I was only 1 week off base. They, as you rightly said, the war had arrived. And from the beginning, let me say this. I think Putin had made a mistake. Putin didn't need to do what he had done. It was not necessary. It plunged the entire world into a crisis. And that is being careful with my language. When I say the whole world, rather than just Europe, what is done, apart from setting precedents in terms of violation of international law, violation of the UN Charter, violation of various agreements in Europe, the reaction from the rest of the world is going to have consequences, negative consequences for all of us. Because the economy of the world now is so integrated that it's like a balloon. You press it here and it expands there, or you squeeze it here and the effect is felt all around. And we still don't know where the Chinese will land. Yes, they've issued word for the Chinese. It's a very strong and powerful statement affirming the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of countries in the world. Now that's a rebuke for Russia and for Putin. So for all of us, I think we've just lost the innocence of sleep. Policymakers, parents, husbands are going to be awake. I don't know for how many months this is going to last. It's a tragedy for this century that you could have this kind, an invasion of an independent country by another independent country, all because you are powerful. I thought we've gotten into the age of law, the age of rationality, the age of reason. We shouldn't have gone back to the age of brutal force to resolve differences. So it's unfortunate. Haven't given that long-winded, if you like, introduction. Let us start at least as analysts, not as propagandists. Number one, I think one of the losers in this political development has been Putin. We've said that. Another loser, and if they're not careful, they will lose their claim to integrity, has been, I don't know whether you allow me to mention names of global media outlets, or I should just choose that term, global media outlet.
Global media outlets is fine.
All right. Since yesterday, they have become propagandists, mouth of their governments, using the kind of language that I never expected to hear from people who should be news presenters rather than, I don't mind if they're analysts, people they bring on board, use the kind of propagandist language that they started to use. And, you know, it's not as if Putin is the only one who has committed crimes since the Second World War in invasion of countries, in overthrowing governments. They're talking now about perhaps the aim of Putin is regime change. Who coined the term regime change? And if you look at it, when was the last time? Is it up to a year that we had regime change? No, aided and abetted by several countries who are now, you know, countries do vicious things and they should be called out for that. But I think we analysts and those who present the news to us owe us. They owe us not a debt, they owe us credibility because we depend on them to tell us as it is, and then let their analysts, you know, put spins on them, but not for them to put spin on what they are telling us. Then where do we turn to? Then for, you know, news, rational news. Tell us as it is happening. So I hope that on our program, at least we would be a platform with a difference. I should say that I don't have a dog in this fight, but unfortunately, as somebody, a scholar in international law, a scholar in international affairs of about 62 years, no, I do have a dog in this fight. It is in the interest of the world to have respect for international law, respect for human rights charter, respect for the United Nations Charter. All of this, Putin had stepped on and marched on. And he should be called out for that. If he succeeds, I mean, how can you say that Ukraine has forfeited the right to be an independent country simply because you have just aided and abetted the excitation of a large part of Ukraine when he recognized those two breakaway provinces. And then his foreign minister came on board, and he then also said, there's no more Ukraine because Ukraine has lost a large part of its territory. Let me be, I won't say flippant. I don't know what the right word is, but let me use his logic. Let me use his logic. When the United Nations Charter was signed, among the three countries that signed that charter are the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and Belarus. Some people have said Georgia. No, not Georgia, it's Belarus. What do you call the Soviet Union now? It's called Russia. So legally, Russia is not a founder of the United Nations, it's the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is dead. Russia is no longer a member of the United Nations. It is the Soviet Union that was a member, and the Soviet Union is dead. So be careful about the logic you put forward in demonizing your opponent, because when you come back, it could be applied to you. What is his objective? I am still puzzled by that. What is his objective? Is it to destroy Ukraine completely? What is it about Ukraine that brings out the demon in Putin? I don't believe for one moment. But in the case of Putin, we have to be careful about how you analyze him and what you believe about him or don't believe. I don't believe that Putin intends to recreate the entire Soviet Union. I don't believe he intends to go after Georgia. I don't think he is going to go after Latvia or Lithuania or Bulgaria or Poland. Yes, just a minute. But if the rationale behind this behavior is that he wants to protect Russian, the Russian exilees, let me call it that way. And later on, I will explain why I use that term. Well, it is not in Ukraine alone that you have Russian exilees. They exist in some of the other former members of the Soviet Union. And why do I use the term exiles? The Russians in Ukraine were planted there by Stalin. They did not belong originally there. You see, in the old Soviet Union, the central government in Moscow can just wake up one morning and say the whole of Wales is now being transferred from where they are to Northern Ireland. Full stop. And there's nothing the Irish will be able to do about it. Or they could say the whole of Cambridgeshire is being transferred from there and being sent to Western Scotland. That was the way they were transferring, peoples all over the place, simply for the purpose of Russification. So if that's what is after, to defend those people, then they are in other parts. And in any case, we should not legitimize that, because in the Balkans, the old Yugoslavia, we still have conflict, not violent, but conflicts going on about the presence of minorities in several of the republics to which the old Yugoslavia broke up to be.
But sir, just to press that point you raised about you not believing that Putin is trying to rebuild the USSR. Some years ago, when the whole issue of Crimea came up, there was a lot of noise about it, but he took it, he maintained it. Now we've come to this one. He's taken the two regions, even though they were led by separatists, but he's taken those two regions. And some may argue that regardless of what happens now, it is unlikely that he's going to give up the separatist regions of Ukraine that he has taken over. Isn't that going to embolden him to continue on this quest of taking other territory?
It will embolden him if the policy of appeasement by Western countries continue to be their response to Putin. I said it on this program, on our platform last year. There were 2 points that I made. The first point was the biggest danger to peace in the world is if nations, especially nations that are not friendly, perceive Biden to be a weak president who doesn't want conflict under any conditions. That if that is the assessment of him, then we are heading for trouble, because they will test him. There are enough troublemakers in the world as to cause sleepless nights for everybody. The second point I made, when the Ukrainian crisis then became hot, was that Biden was wrong strategically to have taken the military option off the table in dealing with Putin. Now, this has been misunderstood by people, by some of the people who've got in touch with me, saying I was encouraging Biden to go to war against Russia. I was talking about processes. I was not talking about the objective. The objective, in fact, was to prevent war. Because if Biden had left Putin guessing as to how far he will go, it will not have emboldened Putin. I believe that what Putin is doing in Ukraine had been a long-term ambition of Putin. But whether he will implement that ambition would depend on whether he thought he will get away with it or not. And the moment that the Americans and NATO and Europe started talking about wishy-washy sanctions, I knew the game was lost. And I was right. You spent all these months breathing fire of sanctions unheard of before. And when Putin recognized those people, and within 24 hours, he made it clear that he was not recognizing them within the boundaries they occupied, but within the boundaries they claim belong to the Russian-speaking party. He said so publicly. I thought the sanctions were going to be immediate, were going to be so total. The only country that has come out of this smelling roses had been the Germans, because within a few hours, they gave their all. They made their own ultimate sacrifice in grounding that pipeline. Grounding that pipeline that was supposed to be carrying Russian gas. Immediately, instead, Britain was talking about two people and 3 banks. The same thing with America, and that they were waiting to see what else Putin would do. That would even frighten a cat, not to talk about Putin. And in any case, what have you spent the past couple of months putting in place when you still say, well, and we are still now considering further sanctions, we are still discussing further sanctions with our allies? What have you spent the past month, Are there thinkers left in the capitals of Europe and the United States? And in any case, do you really think that in all these months, when you have been making those threats, the Russian oligarchs and the crooks who have domiciled the money they stole in Europe have been sleeping? Of course, any money, any amount of money they could move, they will have been moving them to Chinese banks. So you may then even find out yourself that at the end of the day, when you then decide to impose the sanction, there's nothing to sanction. I mean, I was disgusted by the first reaction on sanctions. Take the second tranche of the sanctions now. They've left out SWIFT, which is the app, that you use in banks for whatever it is. And Boris Johnson's explanation was that they were still, they were still negotiating with their allies how to implement that. But that would have grounded immediately banking operations of Soviet banks in Europe. But you haven't imposed that. Instead, you've been You know, I think we now have presidents and prime ministers who believe that language, just language, can achieve miracles. And so when you talk about, we've been forceful in what we've decided to do, it's like Muhammad Ali saying, I've shuffled my feet, therefore my opponent is down without landing a blow. Excuse me, you've just encouraged the man, and he's read all of them right. Now, I mean, the foreign exchange reserves of Russia in terms of dollars is has fallen considerably, and then he had this agreement with China, because China is no longer, a mini economic power. He could still now rely on China to bail him out if he ran into trouble. But I understood that about 76% of the account, the foreign exchange account that he needs, are actually domiciled in Russia itself. So even if he had limited aims and objectives in Ukraine, he's been encouraged, not aided and abetted, but encouraged by the limited response that he has got from the West.
So one question I want to ask is this. Clearly the sanctions haven't worked. When the US was going to send troops to Poland nearby, President Biden said something. He said, oh, this is just meant to be a defensive measure. We don't intend to go to war with Russia. Mm-hmm. At what point do the Western economies shift beyond sanctions and respond with military force?
I think it will be if there is a direct assault on NATO forces, whether in Latvia or in Lithuania or in Poland, or Bulgaria. All that front line is only during the time of the anti-apartheid struggle. We used to talk about frontline countries who were confronting the apartheid regime. I was listening now to the NATO Secretary General talking about frontline countries, frontline NATO countries in Europe. I think it will be when there is a direct assault. Now, given the games that the Western countries are playing, what constitutes direct assault? Will it be when one Russian soldier crosses the boundary of the frontline country? Or will it be when one Russian bullet flies across the boundary? Or will it be when a Russian plane flies across the airspace of a NATO member and bumps, and then they will now say, well, it was accidental. It was not deliberate. Therefore, it will not activate Article 5 of the NATO treaty. But it's obvious. It's obvious to Putin that they want at all costs to avoid getting into a fight with him. And the thing is, does he want to get into a fight with them? Don't forget that there came a point when Hitler didn't mind, getting into a fight with the Western allies at the beginning of the World War II. I hope he doesn't make that mistake, but where is the resolve? Where is the resolve of NATO countries? When I listened to the speech of the Ukrainian president, do you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of the last speech by I think this was 1966, when you had the I will call it the East European Spring. And there were demonstrations in Prague, demonstrations in East Germany for freedom from the Soviet Union, Hungary. And the Soviet troops came into Hungary, and the, if you like, freedom president of Hungary made that last address and said this will be the last address of the free people of Hungary. And it was still in the middle of that when the Soviet forces shelled the radio station. That's what came to my mind, that are we listening to the voice of the free Ukrainians? Is history repeating itself? Because when that happened, again, the people were expecting that the Western countries, I'm talking about 66 or so, or 66 Hungarian Revolution, were expecting American troops or NATO troops to come to their defense or to their support. And of course, geopolitics did not allow them to do that. Simply because the Americans, NATO, did not want a nuclear war with the Soviet Union at that time. Nobody wants a nuclear war. We will all be losers. But where do you then draw the line from empowering or encouraging or emboldening a dictator with insatiable appetite for land acquisition? Where do you draw the line? You let him know, fine, you want a war on your hand, we will all be losers, but we are not going to let you gobble up all this country and recreate the Soviet Union. Because in a way, if Putin succeeds in recreating the Soviet Union, it's also a threat to the United States, because you're going to be dealing with a combination of a recreated Soviet Union and a resurgent China.
Wow. One key area, sir, that I want to get your views on is the role the United Nations has played in this. Up until recently, they appeared to be relatively silent. And when it became apparent that this was pretty much turning into a full-scale invasion, then we started to hear a lot more. What role should the United Nations have played in trying to avert this situation?
The United Nations is at its best when two parties to a conflict are looking for an interlocutor to help them climb down from their high horses. When they've got to the limit of aggressive postures, and they themselves think the next step we are going to be falling into the abyss. We need somebody to pull us back. Then they look towards the United Nations, and they are then ready for the United Nations to use the good offices of the Secretary General or peacekeeping operations or what have you. If the Secretary General tries to intervene before you get to that fine age, they will accuse him of being an interloper and that his intervention had in fact created more problems for everybody. And that is why the Secretary General, until yesterday, just yesterday, after the recognition of those two breakaway regions, which amounted, if you like, to a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, that he then spoke forcefully, followed today by also speaking forcefully. He played the game well. That's the way it's supposed to be played. If he had tried before now, they would have said, you know, he created more problems. He must keep that office and person of Secretary General waiting at the wings, probably even whispering to both parties. Because behind the scene, he could have been talking to them, talking to their ambassadors at the UN, making calls to their foreign ministers, but behind the scenes, no publicity. That way, they could say no to him without him losing face. And then when they need him, they could always then come back and say, incidentally, what you said last month, we've been giving it some thought. Are you still, Mr. Secretary General, of the view that we and the Americans should be, that is the right time? So I don't blame the Secretary General at all. He's played the card very well.
One area that we've seen, sir, is even before we saw the invasion from the Russian forces on ground, we started to see something which was, I think, starting to get a little bit more unique in this time we're in. I would say there was an e-invasion that had happened ahead of time, where Ukraine's, a lot of the government websites had been hit by cyber attacks. Sir, what is your view on that side of things? Because it looks like that's where the warfare has started in this particular case. What is your view on what has happened there, sir?
Either there was not sufficient evidence of where that e-attack was coming from on Ukraine, or the response capability of the Western countries is still not ratcheted up to par to respond. Because what I would have thought is, in fact, as soon as that attack on Ukraine took place, the West would then respond by also launching attacks on the Ministry of Defense of Russia in order to weaken their capability to mount the operations which they're mounting now. So either way, And I think I said this when you raised it, when there were attacks on American banks about 2 years ago on one of our programs. And I said, there must be something we don't know, but that both sides know, that America feels it can only scream that those behind the attacks, if America gets to know them, there will be repercussions. And I remember putting in the meeting with Biden in Geneva, I believe it was, is it towards the end of that last year or so, when he was asked at a press conference, he said, well, the Americans also know who's been launching attacks against us. We just don't talk about them. So there is a lot we don't know in this game of electronic attacks on facilities, who has the capability to do what and why it isn't being done in retaliation.
Thank you for that analysis on Russia, sir. In the last 15 minutes we've got, let's touch a few other topics. Let's start with the UK. The UK government has today lifted all restrictions related to COVID-19. What do you take from that, sir, at such a time like this when our Queen is suffering from COVID? What is your view on that, sir?
You've answered your own question.
Is that right, wrong?
With Her Majesty being under the weather, if I were Prime Minister, I wouldn't have lifted. I wouldn't have lifted the measures that were put in place. But we wish Her Majesty well. We wish her quick recovery. She served. The first time I saw her face to face was in 1956 when she came on a visit, or was it 57? I know I was in secondary school at that time, and we were all marched into the stadium to wave the Union Jack as she drove around. That would be the first time that I will, very beautiful young lady at that time. Of course, we were all struck, you know. And then as foreign minister, I met her several times at Commonwealth conferences. And you know, I mean, just imagine how many years she had performed that service, through how many British prime ministers, how many Commonwealth heads of states, and so on. She's paid her dues, and I think that she should always be at the back of the minds of governments when they are making policies that could have a personal effect on her. When I say personal effect, one could affect her emotionally. For example, to me, it was uncalled for to have held a party, number 10 Downing Street, on the eve of the burial of her husband, Prince Philip. just as I believe that, the British people wouldn't have minded if you said, look, let's just wait for Her Majesty to get over this and be back on her feet before we make any further announcements on lifting of COVID-19 restrictions. But there we are. We wish her well.
Thank you, sir. Let us go to Kenya. Two things I want to put to you, sir. Let's start on the slightly more jovial note, and then we end with the more serious one. The Kenyan government is picking on Nigerian musicians specifically. And they're saying that Nigerian music is dominating Kenya Airways, and that they feel that they should put measures in place to limit that. Is that big enough an issue to warrant a diplomatic response from the Nigerian Commission in Kenya?
Absolutely not. I think if the Kenyan government has already got that magic wand by which it blocks the internet wave, they should share that with everybody. Even governments will queue to pay for that magic wand. It's a silly thing. And why don't governments ever learn? Music is for the youth. The moment you tell the youth, you cannot do this, that's precisely what they're going to do. They will find out there must be something about this Nigerian music that frightens our government. And therefore, they'll find their way. The youth of these days are more clever than governments. You are all IT geeks. So I think there should be more important things for the Kenya government to turn its attention to than Nigerian music. It's like again telling African youth not to watch Nollywood films. Whatever is of entertainment value to youth, they will go there.
Thank you, sir. So let's deal with the more serious one. President Uhuru Kenyatta is getting to that point in his presidency where he served the terms he can serve, and he will have to leave government. Well, if they don't change the constitution like we see in Africa sometimes, but he will have to leave government after he's completed his term. But he's expected to endorse Raila Odinga as his successor. What do you say to that, sir?
Not that is expected to endorse. He endorsed him about 24 hours ago. And one could, on one hand, say this is a move by Uhuru Kenyatta to ensure that there will be no violence before, during, and after the transition from one government to the other. And that is going to do this, and that is done this by endorsing the opposition. Because the Kenyattas and the Odingas have never been political allies, but that he was playing out the role of a statesman by ensuring that as his final act during this period of his exit from office, he will do this. On the other hand, maybe he and his deputy, who is also contesting, have not been getting along. One of the things that had amazed me about politics in Africa is how sitting presidents or governors don't want their deputies to succeed to them. I mean, where I'm speaking from in Nigeria, I've never known of one single case where a president has or a governor has endorsed his deputy. Instead, they look for an outsider to endorse, to take over from them. And they will support that outsider during the election. I've never understood that syndrome. Maybe because I've never been a president and I've never been a governor, because I would assume that your deputy haven't been the closest person to you in the 4 years or 8 years while you are in office. You will count on him to continue with the policies, unless you have marginalized him during that period. He had fundamentally disagreed with your policies, and you've just kept him walking the corridors of power while you're implementing your own. Unless it is that is really what governs this behavior towards deputies succeeding their principles. So it's we are now back to the two-handed economists. On one hand, maybe it was a statesman-like act. On the other hand, maybe it's evidence of the state of antagonism between Uhuru Kenyatta, the sitting president, and Ezekuo, who is the vice president, or somebody like that.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for that. But sir, you raise a very, very fantastic point in terms of the sitting president or governor endorsing their deputies or the vice presidents. America we see as a very big exception in terms of President Biden and President Obama, former President Obama. But is that just an African thing? Or it seems to be other countries have this similar approach to what we're seeing in Africa?
No, that's why I was careful in my choice of words. I said in this part of the world where I am sitting, this is what I have noticed. Of course, where the party is more powerful than the incumbent, e.g., South Africa, then the party decides who takes over. So Cyril Ramaphosa took over from President Zuma, and Zuma took over from President
Mbeki.
Mbeki, and Mbeki took over from Mandela. That's a situation where the party was more powerful, more entrenched than the incumbents. And in the United States, it's often also not, it depends. America has so many peculiarities. This lady, Mrs. Clinton, was the one who ran after Obama. It was after she lost that Biden then, stepped into the position of a contestant. In the case of Trump, who knows what would have happened, if he had done 8 years, whether he would have supported his opponent. But usually in the United States, the vice president in a party becomes the candidate after the president has done his 2 terms. And I mean, one could run through a whole series. Even when the president is very, very lukewarm and decides that he will not even be an active supporter of his deputy. Lyndon Baines Johnson did not really support Humphrey, Hubert Humphrey, who was his vice president. And he of them went on to lose, to Nixon. So, but it is in, well, I shouldn't say it's in Africa, I've noticed it, because look at the Conservative Party in Britain. When was the last time a deputy prime minister succeeded in taking over government from a departing prime minister? Again, maybe because it is the party that picks who takes over through very convoluted series of elections from a departing prime minister, unless it is through a general election. So,
thank you for that. One last reaction I want from you before we close tonight, sir, and that is Ethiopia. They've just come out of this long season of war, and they have now begun the production of electricity for the first time from their dam. What do you have to say about how they've gone from war to such a major achievement on this Renaissance dam?
Well, it's been a fascinating development. 1 minute, Ethiopia was being written off, being called a failed state, expected to collapse. And now, and I was again, I mean, I'm not blowing my trumpet about being a prophet, but from the beginning, I was warning that the Tigrayans, who for 35 years or so formed the central government in Ethiopia, could not launch a military attack on the central government because they lost out there and then went back to their territory to now be making accusations of marginalization and what have you. And that there were forces, international forces behind them. But the central government of Ethiopia rose up to their responsibility to defend that ancient kingdom where they don't have a king anymore, suppose ancient republic, that has a spiritual value for we Africans. Not just the fact that it's the headquarters of the African Union, but when you think of the role of Emperor Haile Selassie in mediating so many conflicts, including the Nigerian Civil War, and the fact that he stood up to the Italians during the Second World War, and to now have a rebellious force wanting to scatter all of that. We again, with the central government stood up to its responsibility and defeated them, and nobody now talks about them anymore. In fact, if anything, there was a report last week about the atrocities of the Tigrayan Liberation Front in Amhara, another province of, I know Ethiopia very well, in another part of Ethiopia. And so I'm so glad that the news that's come before us now is the turning on of the Renaissance Dam, providing electricity to areas of Ethiopia that has never had electricity. But the issue is not over. Now, Africa must find some way of reconciling Ethiopia on one hand, the Sudan, and Egypt on the other hand, to ensure that there is no that the conflict over the dam is resolved peacefully, and that there will be no sabotage activities. It's too late for us to go into the history of the River Nile and how the waters were divided, because it was a game played between Great Britain and Egypt, where Britain didn't pay any attention to the fact that there were other countries that were dependent on River Nile and was simply using it to reward Egypt or punish Egypt during the decolonization process. I wish Ethiopia well, and I hope that Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sudan will keep Africa in mind as they go into their next round of reconciliation process.
Thank you very much, sir, for this evening. And thank you to our viewers for being there. We appreciate you all the time for being here with us. Thank you for some of the comments that I can see here. And I think that Prof dealt with almost all the points that were raised there. So thank you very much for your time to our viewers, and thank you very much, sir. We'll be back here again same time next week as we continue the program. Good night.